Welcome to the webinar Funding the Future. We are extremely excited to be here with you. Over 280 participants from 39 countries. We couldn't believe when we saw the sign-ups coming in. And this is not just Europe. It's also countries like Peru, it's Panama, we've got Thailand, we've got Ghana, Burundi. It really shows that what we're talking about is a global issue. And so we're really thrilled to be here with three fabulous panelists and a wonderful keynote speaker. And my co-host, Max van Abendroth from Daphne, the Donors and Foundations Network in Europe, who joined Daphne in 2007. My name is Felicity von Peter. I'm the founder of Active Philanthropy, a platform based in Berlin that supports funders and philanthropists to get involved in climate and tries to help to navigate the complexity of climate with various activities such as these webinars. I want to kick us off with Max, who will also give you a brief welcome, and then we'll turn it over to Sandrine Dixon-Declève. But Max, over to you.
Thank you very much, Felicitas, and a warm welcome to everyone for this exciting webinar with great speakers on board. Daphne is the European umbrella organization of foundations and donors. We are based in Brussels in Philanthropy House, and we are very close to the EU. And a coincidence, this week is EU's Green Week, where nature and biodiversity are discussed. And this is a very important week for the EU because that's high up on the priority agenda, obviously. We, as Daphne, we do many different things, mainly about networking, building infrastructure for philanthropy across Europe. Now, since a few months, we are very active in the climate field as well. We set up the Philanthropy Coalition for Climate together with Carasso Foundation and some of our members from the UK, Spain, and France. And this coalition is really there to pave the ground for an ecosystem for change in Europe and ideally beyond. We do this with the funder commitment on climate change, which is currently implemented in the UK, in France, and in Spain. And we also do this by supporting the effectiveness of existing climate philanthropy networks by connecting them and helping them to make an even better job. So this is where Daphne is in all this. I'm very excited to have this debate today and hope this brings us one step further as a sector towards climate action. Thank you.
Thank you, Max, and more on your work later on. But we want to turn it over to Sandrine. A quick remark on questions. You will have a Q&A box in your panel. We have disabled the chat function for today. But there is a Q&A box and you can ask your questions. We have received already close to 100 questions ahead of the webinar, which really shows how much this topic is in need to be discussed. So thrilled to invite Sandrine Dixon-Declève, the not so new anymore co-president of the Club of Rome, to give us your insights as to the role of foundations in these crucial next 12 months, but actually 12 years coming up.
So I want to come to this as wearing three different hats, because I think it's important to indicate that I am president of the Club of Rome and therefore have 50 years of experience behind me through the members of the club and the publications, which have very much spoken already about climate change 50 years ago and the limits to growth, but also is working with the European Commission think tank on the economic and societal implications of research and innovation, and my work on sustainable finance, and the advisory board of Climate Kick, which looks at innovation and deep demonstrations in the area of climate. And what I'd like to start off with is already 50 years ago, this particular quote really compelled me to think about, and the rest of the Club of Rome, around how can we do things differently? Because if already 50 years ago we were talking about a decade of action that was necessary and serious redirection, we've seen that actually we were not able to accomplish those aims. Clearly, due to the global warming projections, you can see here that already with current policies, we are only going to meet 3.1 to 3.7 degrees, and our goal through Paris was 1.5. And the existing pledges that we have brought us to 2.6. New research that we've seen actually from some of our members, our scientists at the Club of Rome, had demonstrated that actually we'll probably be at 1.5 by 2030. So for me, this is clearly, and for the club, a decade of action. We need to figure out how we can unpack the tensions now between the human dimension of COVID-19, the biodiversity loss that we've seen in the crisis, and the climate crisis. Because we are facing, as was said in the film, the greatest existential threat ever to our existence on this planet. What we've tried to do, therefore, is unpack this contextual piece and get a better understanding with our scientists, our economists, as to how we can actually impact this decade of action. We've looked at the political landscape, and if you look at Europe, we are now facing a 60% emissions target in 2030. Many will claim that is too low. China has declared carbon neutrality by 2060. Still too low if we're going to be at 1.5 by 2030. We've got, however, biodiversity and climate high ambition countries that are coming together to try to unpack what is necessary right now and increasing support for nature-based solutions. But clearly what's missing still is the US, Brazil, and Russia. How do you couple this with the business landscape? The biggest way that we were able to influence at least the patterns of shifts that we're seeing now and have an impact on, for example, parity in terms of prices for renewables and fossil energy, was by putting pressure through business collaboration. We have now a growing interest also beyond just divestment in fossil energy and investment in renewable energy, a growing interest in circularity and regenerative economies. So how can we actually continue to build that interest in companies? And there are increasingly more collaborations around there. What we've seen through COVID is also the value chain resilience issue. Localities, communities, how can we actually build greater resilience within local production of food, but also how can we stop our dependency on natural resources and the continuation of the destruction of the environmental and also climate ecosystems that we have due to that dependency. And then we see a growing, in terms of the business landscape, some interest in ESG criteria, so environment, social, and governance criteria, and SDG criteria integration into business plans. And what's really interesting, so the positives of that, is that it's demonstrating greater resilience coming out of COVID. If we can build on all of these new broader opportunities and examples in the next decade, that's what we need to focus on. And we need to bring civil society on board. What we've been doing is trying to figure out how to work with all of the activist movements to do a double squeeze, campaigning from the outside, and then influencing from the inside through business voices and policy voices that are really shifting the paradigm. We've done that through what we call our planetary emergency plan. And through this planetary emergency plan, and I have to be very clear, 2 years ago, we called it the climate emergency plan. But through that, we were able to start to influence and create a dialogue, also with the help of incredible activism at the youth level, 1,788 jurisdictions in 31 countries who declared a climate emergency. The problem there, to be honest with you, is that they haven't translated necessarily these declarations into action plans. And what we're saying in our action plans, in order to meet that 1.5 target and to look really at this great threat over the next 10 years, we need to focus on how we can actually ensure the global commons. How can we protect our ecosystems, our critical ecosystems, deforestation? How can we ensure that we stop drilling in the Arctic? How can we ensure that we stop actually the permafrost from melting? In some cases, we know that we cannot build back glaciers, but we have to put in place at least the right finance and investment possibilities to restore our critical ecosystems and to ensure that we create zones that stop actually the impacts that we have currently. Linked to that, we also are calling for 10 urgent actions. And this is the way in which we now, through our impact hubs, in the Club of Rome, but working with what we call the Planetary Emergency Partnership, 250 organizations coming together, focusing on 3 key areas. And this is where you start to see the intersections of the convergence of the tipping points between climate change, biodiversity, and the health pandemic. We have to focus on the justice issue. And if I look at your questions, many of you have asked, how do we bring together the just transition conversation, the communities conversation, the social conversation, and the gender conversation? And you can see through these first points that we've actually been trying to see the same. We have to start calling for economic progress indicators that actually do that in a systematic way. Some will call that the well-being economy, which starts to translate how we actually shift from a growth paradigm into putting in place the right indicators for human health, for well-being, and for costing ecological externalities. We have to revolutionize taxation. Taxation is a key area where we need to start pulling out from subsidies that are actually perverse and putting that funding into the right value-driven ecological and social investments. Then we clearly need to transform our energy systems and shift to circular and regenerative economies. And if we look at those 10 points, which I'm not going to spend more time on, what we see is that we can then have a direct impact on continued climate change as well as biodiversity loss and the social implications. The hope, which many of you are asking for, where is the hope? The hope is clearly in a wide range of proven solutions. And we've got those solutions. We've got those technologies. The key is to link up the technologies with the way in which we work within different systems. And this is what we call the donut. One of our members of the Club of Rome, Kate Rayworth, is very much looking at how you can integrate new technology shifts within the donut in new models of governance. For example, in Amsterdam, Brussels, Seattle, Vancouver, and now other localities, she's putting in place this donut. So what we've done is we've shifted from just thinking about climate change into a broader systemic shift, because we know also post-COVID that lives and livelihoods are absolutely key, and we need to bring people on that journey. This type of narrative enables people to actually be part of the discussion, enables also us to start to think about how we bring in health and health concerns, as well as the broader spectrum of ecological concerns. Maybe giving you some very quick examples of where we also have hope, at least at the European level. We've seen that through, again, this double whammy of putting campaigning and business and also policymakers together to push the European Investment Bank to divest from investments in fossil energy. And this actually now has happened. We have seen a shift even within the banking community of starting to indicate that actually companies and industries which aren't aiming for net zero emissions will go bankrupt, because of the fact that they've seen that stranded assets are actually not investable. And that coming out of COVID, we're seeing, as I said, greater resilience in those companies that have invested in environmental, social, and governance indicators. We're also seeing a political shift in some areas. Very interesting political hope in Europe, where actually climate change is no longer just part of the green policy, but actually being promoted by the European Central Bank, the President of the European Commission, who's a card-carrying conservative, the Council, and the European Investment Bank. And I'll continue with that hope in terms of how we're looking at linking up an integrated action on climate, biodiversity, human health, and well-being. Because I think that this also brings in the complexity, but yet also the interlinkages between all the different types of policies and issues that need to be looked at. We can look at transport and natural capital and circular economy and zero pollution, all of these different policies at the same time, from a systemic perspective, which comes back again to the donut. At the end of the day, what we're seeing is that climate change now is part of a broader convergence of tipping points thinking. And that in the 21st century, if we're able to package that also into what we're calling well-being economics, a much more systemic approach in terms of articulating human development within the 21st century, this will bring people on board. Because what we noticed is that actually in the Club of Rome, over the last 50 years, what we lacked was a broader, massive movement. Now with climate activism and also the business community starting to transform, with COVID, which is enabling us to tap into the consciousness of people who are realizing actually what is essential, we can start to think about a world in balance, but we need to do it through those actions that we have very clearly put forward in that planetary emergency plan and work with a variety of different actors. The key learning has been that we need more emergency plans and translation of those plans, that we need action now for resilience later, that actually transformational, not incremental shifts are fundamental. So picking those areas that are transformational. Collaboration has been essential across sectors, different businesses, radical collaboration amongst different organizations, as well as between countries. Business unusual, not business as usual, is clearly part of the strategy, and we need to be much more strategic. What we're saying now in the Planetary Emergency Partnership is we have to work across the health community, the climate community, the biodiversity community, to bring solutions to this global emergency, which is not based on just one issue. Clearly, we need to look at just transition, and we need to bring people on the journey, and we need to see how we can indicate to people that more circularity is fundamental, as well as regenerative processes. And I'll just end with saying that this holistic systems approach is actually really gaining traction. If you look at the European Commission, they're shifting their thinking to people, planet, and prosperity, as well as their governance. If you look at the conversations that we've had with different governments, if we don't think about health and COVID at the same time as climate, it's very difficult for them to focus. So we need to bring both in. And I'll just leave it at that and say that clearly what we've been trying to say is that the planet is the moonshot. Focusing on the planet as the moonshot has enabled us to really gather more collaborative partners around this very idea that we don't need to go somewhere else, but we need to save what we have.
Thank you very much, Sandrine, for this fire starter, I would say, which is very much the reason why we decided to write the guide Funding the Future, because we believe that the topics are increasingly interlinked. We cannot just talk about climate, we need to talk about climate in relation to all the other topics that you mentioned. But before we go into a discussion with three foundations that have actually put this mindset into practice and will share with us how they've done so, because we shouldn't forget climate is fairly new, the awareness about climate, and it takes some time to adapt your thinking around that. Let's hear from our colleague Johannes Lundershausen, who is the lead author of the report, about some of the high-level insights of the report.
Hello, and a very warm welcome also from my side. My name is Johannes Lundershausen, and I'm very happy to share with you some of the key messages from our report. Most of you participating here today are philanthropists or you work at foundations. As such, you address some of the most pressing issues that European societies face today. Some of you protect ecosystems from destruction. Others try to make our democracies more resilient against populism, advance gender equality, or fight for better healthcare. Unfortunately, all of these issues and several others can only be addressed if we also address climate change. Scientists have warned us about the consequences of climate change for decades, but these times of predictions are over. We have arrived at a point where we can witness these consequences every day and in every place around the planet. This is why we need every single one of you, every foundation and every philanthropist, to engage in the fight against climate change. Our report, Funding the Future, therefore highlights the intersections between traditional funding areas and climate change. The report will help you to integrate climate change into your work without losing sight of the issues that have always been close to your heart. We share the example of a dozen organizations that have already gone first steps into that direction. Let me give you two examples of the intersections that we discuss, namely health and nature conservation. Climate change and health are inextricably linked. To give you just one example, the fight against climate change is often synonymous with the fight against air pollution. The reason for that is that air pollutants are often themselves greenhouse gases, or they're derived from the same sources, such as cars. Just how damaging such emissions are for people's health is shown by the tragic case of Ella Kissi-Debrah. The girl grew up in an area of London where air pollution limits were consistently exceeded. For years she suffered from breathing difficulties, and in 2013 she tragically died from an asthma attack at the age of 9. Meanwhile, a full legal inquiry is underway that considers whether air pollution contributed and caused the death of Ella. Statistically, the relationship is rather clear. In 2015, for example, Europe saw more than 500,000 people dying prematurely as a result of air pollution. Especially in times of COVID-19 that also attacks the respiratory tracts, we should act more swiftly on air pollution. The Clean Air Fund is one of the most important actors in this field and one of the case studies in our guide. Another, more recent player is the German foundation Healthy Planet, Healthy People. The foundation highlights that one of the most effective ways of driving climate action is to produce positive narratives that resonate with people. This is why we encourage funders who want to work at the intersection of climate change and health to focus on individual health benefits, supporting measures such as pollution control or vegetable-based diets. Is not just good for the climate, but also promotes personal health. One of the most striking intersections is maybe that between climate and nature conservation. Funders who are protecting ecosystems and biodiversity can easily do something for the climate. A good example of this is the restoring of wetlands, such as peatlands or mangrove forests. These ecosystems absorb huge amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere and store it in their soils and plants. As a matter of fact, peatlands are one of the most efficient natural carbon sinks in the world. Scotland is a country with an exceptionally large area covered by peatlands, but in the past many of them were drained for the benefits of agriculture and forestry. Today, the Scottish Government has recognized this as a mistake and provides financial support to landowners who are willing to deconstruct the old draining ditches. Within 5 to 15 years, these peatlands become fully functional again. And in 2030, all Scottish peatlands may store as much CO2 as the whole of India emits in 1 year. The intersection between climate change and nature conservation in our report is illustrated by the Daniel and Nina Carasso Foundation. They highlight how important engagements in ecological agriculture are. Many farms still need support in transitioning to climate-resilient agriculture. Responding to climate change is an enormous challenge. We have to adapt to a world that is warmer now than it has ever been in the history of humanity on this planet. In order to avoid catastrophic climate change, we have to decarbonize our emissions quickly. By 2030, we must reach the peak of our emissions. But how can we tackle such an enormous challenge? We can only do so together. We cannot just rely on foundations that already specialize on climate change, but we do need all of you. All funders, regardless of the traditional focus areas, can do something to tackle the climate crisis. This is the key message of our report. And the case studies show that and how this can be done. If you'd like to explore your own case in further detail, please do get in touch with us. In addition to highlighting the intersections between traditional funding areas and climate change, we also highlight ways of incorporating climate change into the operations of your organization. One of the most effective ways of doing so surely is to divest from fossil fuels and to ensure that your financial investments do not further contribute to climate change. But if you are to take away one thing from this discussion today, it should be this. Each and every one of you can play an active role in shaping the climate of our future. With this, I want to thank you for your attention and wish you a very interesting and lively discussion with the following panel.
Thank you very much, Johannes. And he'll be a part of the Q&A later on in case you've got questions. And because some of these questions came up, will the slides be shared? Yes, we will share Sandrine's slides, as well as further references and resources in a follow-up email tomorrow. But first, let's turn to the three fantastic foundations that have already started their journey, some a little longer ago, some more recent, on integrating a climate lens into their portfolio. And we'd like to start with Sonia Medina from the Children's Investment Fund Foundation first. Sonia is the Executive Director of the Climate Change Program, and the Children's Investment Fund Foundation is the world's largest philanthropy focused on children and youth, and Europe's largest funder in climate. While that might be today seem obvious, it wasn't some time ago. So Sonia, kick us off by sharing how you got started to get interested in climate, or rather the founder, and how you've built the bridge between climate and children's issues, and what your recommendations would be for foundations that are trying to figure out what it is they can do as they start to grasp with this complexity of the issue.
Thank you so much, Felicitas, and it is an absolute honor and a real pleasure for me to be with all of you today. And I hope it is in person at some point, but this will have to do for the time being. It is nevertheless a real delight to be able to talk about these issues. So as Felicitas has mentioned, the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, CIFF for short, was initially set up and to focus on child health and malnutrition. And this focus very much continues today, is our mission. And we are very specifically focused on improving children's lives around the world. And that has been the mission of the foundation for the 2 decades in operation. But early on, it became very apparent that climate change was going to be a very serious problem for all our programs. For example, as we have heard from Sandrine and others and in the reports, recurrent and significant droughts and crop failure, for example, in Africa, will drive malnutrition, is driving malnutrition, and that is attributable to climate change. It impacts agricultural productivity and therefore food security, water scarcity, spreads the deadly diseases, vector-borne diseases, and also zoonotic diseases, as we are seeing with the pandemic today. So if you really want to make a difference to today's children's, and of course the future generations, but also today's children's living in poverty, you must tackle climate change. And this was our starting point. So about 10 years ago, we started addressing climate change more forcefully and more surgically into our work. And we started relatively small and have been growing organically in size and scope ever since. So in 2010, our climate portfolio was about $26 million. We now have over $500 million invested in multi-year grants across many countries around the world. And this year, for example, we will be disbursing for the very first time over $150 million on climate out of a total budget of the foundation of about $350 million. So about 40% from 0% when we first started, and about less than 10% 10 years ago when we started giving. So it's been a learning journey for us that, of course, we continue. We have built our climate work steadily over time, as I said. So we started in Europe. We are based in London. We're very much a European foundation. And the early grants were primarily on power sector decarbonization, primarily focused on renewables. But since then, we have been expanding on cities work, addressing air conditioning problems, cities, transports, forests, land use, industry. Is quite a wide range portfolio nowadays, not only in Europe, but also China, India, Southeast Asia, Mexico, and Brazil. Our children's work is primarily focused on Africa and India, by the way. So what have we learned? And what will be my recommendations? And I'd be very happy to answer questions lately. There is no one set approach to integrating climate change into your portfolio. The opportunities to get involved are vast. Climate change will ultimately affect all aspects of life in our planet. So there is room for everybody and for all sorts of approaches. So identify what resonates with you, where you believe you can add the most value, and just jump on the train and get going, because impact is urgent. It is key that we get addressing the climate challenge very quickly, because as the science has been said, it is we have very little time left. We are bending the curve of temperature rise, but it is really important to get going. So what have we learned? And I know I have little time left. That grant making around climate is slightly different. Public policy offers huge leverage for us, and for that, political economy analysis, communication, mobilization, advocacy, it's critical. Long-term commitment to building institutions and our civil society groups in this space is critical, because collaboration is critical. We must punch above our weight, and we don't get there if we're not united on these issues. And third, we must have a global mindset, in the sense that, for example, getting right China and really helping them deliver on their carbon neutrality pledge, or in Europe, really helping the European Green Deal become a reality, become huge forces of change globally. So going for that global impact and outside of your boundaries sometimes is the right thing to do. With that, I'll pass it on back to Felicitas. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. And we should also say, with a little wave to our colleagues from the US, it's not just getting China right, it's also getting the US right. So whoever can help to make that happen, please do. But I know all of you on this chat know this already. Quick question, also based on what Sandrine was talking about early on. You talk a lot about changing energy systems. Sandrine talked about changing taxation. All of these are deeply political topics. We know that foundations sometimes are a little bit reticent to be too political. What's your feel for this in hindsight of the previous years? Do foundations have to become more political when they enter the field of climate?
So Sandrine, if you, I'm happy to take it first. I would say it's not about becoming party political, but you have to be more politically aware. And for that is that the political economy analysis of the policies that need to be put forward needs to be able to resonate with the full range of the population, from left-leaning voters to center-right to other type of voters. Traditionally, our civil society groups have been more aligned with center-left and left-leaning voters, because that is where our civil society groups have found their funding base and where they have found more of the resonance on these issues. That is not good enough nowadays, because, for example, a lot of the problems that we have around just transition is there may be more center-right voters, and where the way in which you frame why the policy must be undertaken need to resonate with them, and you have to meet them where they are. So I think there is a difference between being party political. We can't, foundations cannot be party political. It is against our charitable objectives, it is against our charitable registration, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be politically aware as to how to reach everyone where they are.
Super.
Can I add to that, Felicitas?
Yes, please. Briefly.
I'll just quickly add that I completely agree with Sonia, and I think that even ourselves, we've tried to be very careful in that sense. But what we now have focused on is impact. And I think that if foundations want to look at the decade of action, it's a question of deciding where they feel their funding could be most impactful. And clearly in the energy area, that is one area that we've seen in the past, and we know we could really have a fundamental decrease in emissions. But there, now we're starting to see that there are other areas as well. So not just focusing on energy, but focusing on agriculture, focusing on where can you actually feel that you have the greatest impact? Where's your greatest value? That is the conversation that we're having all the time now.
Super. With that was a perfect segue to George, whom I'd like to bring on next. George is a very seasoned, not just philanthropist, but also advisor and a pathfinder, maybe. You've worked, George, with one of the major European families in two of their foundations, Porticus as well as the Laudes Foundation. And the family has made the gutsy decision to integrate climate across all of their portfolios, and you've helped them to do so. How did that happen, and what happened in the process?
Yes, thank you very much, Felicity. First of all, I'm happy to be part of this journey with so many people attending this webinar. Maybe it's also good to share a little bit what are the reasons for us to share what we learned over this process. And actually, there are three main factors. First of all, we very much realized that we are in this together, and that we should be able to leverage the effect of the actions by every foundation, everyone who plays a role in this field. Second consideration was about speed, because we also thought that learning from each other is actually a key element in order to increase speed. And last but not least, we were also inspired by the lessons and insights that Sonia, during our pathfinding way of working, gave us last year. And she actually encouraged us to share what we could share and make sure that the learnings move on. So she gave us a good way forward. The Branding My Group owns not only family business, but also executes their philanthropic activities through a number of foundations, each with its own objective, methodology, and focus area in order to be successful in the areas that they play. The common denominator is that they actually base their work on the same mission, the same principles, the heritage, and the competencies and skills of the family. The Good Energies Foundation, for instance, which was founded in 2007, works in the field of forest protection already for many, many years, and also in the field of access to clean energy for people who live in poverty. But still, in October 2018, when the IPCC report was published, which gave us a clear scientific report on the state of nature and climate, was actually for us a call for action. And in the context of a family conference on climate change with all family members in one room, the one question was asked: are we doing enough? Are we doing enough in light of our mission to help to reverse climate change? And with all facts at the table, the answer was crystal clear. No, we do not do enough. and we should do more. But then the second question was asked, yeah, but how? Where do we start? Do we have sufficient knowledge? Can we really make a difference? So we started a process across the philanthropic entities within the group, exploring these questions. Like, what could be our aspiration? Where should we play? How would we execute? What skills do we need? And in that process, there was an involvement of a lot of stakeholders, scientists, family members, staff, other foundations like CIFF, and experts. And basically, it came down to find that spot within the fields of climate change and mitigation where we could create optimal value and impact based on who we are. So that it means that it really becomes authentic. And by leveraging our networks, our skills, the heritage, and guided again by our mission. So we didn't build our strategies from scratch. We used the experience and of the work that was already done by the Good Energies Foundation with Porticus and Laudes Foundation as a starting point. And we added the input from experts on the question, where's the biggest bang for the buck? And we filtered this with resonance with family members to make sure that the commitment would be authentic and powerful. We also made sure that the elements of the interventions would be linked and integrated in order to create multiplier effects, not only within philanthropy, but also in other parts of the group. And it resulted in two strategies. The first one we called From Forest to Buildings, which actually focused on securing the value of existing forests and scaling up restoration, boosting demands of forest products, and create a net zero carbon building pathway. So really focused on buildings and the built environment. The second strategy was to focus on accelerating the transition to a post-carbon society, including aspects like just transition, which is very much a Porticus theme, financial incentives, and innovation. And both of these strategies were at the heart of who we are. And so within 6 months, we were able to start funding interventions. Good Energies Foundations, Porticus, and Laudes Foundation now full speed ahead in executing these strategies. So what's the learning of this? Actually, the paradox of our learnings is that in essence, it doesn't matter where you start. It's far more, and I fully agree with Sonia, it's far and far more important not to wait and start now. That's actually basically what we learned on this exercise.
Thank you very much, George, for sharing these insights and learnings. Very valuable for everyone here in this seminar or this workshop. I would like to move on immediately to Marie-Stéphane Maradeix from Carasso, Daniel and Nina Carasso Foundation, a foundation that is a grant-making foundation active in France and Spain, and is active around human well-being. So they have a sustainable food program and an art in the community program. And climate is now top of the agenda. Marie-Stéphane, very visionary. Would be great if you could share what brought you to this topic and how are you developing your vision as a foundation around this?
Thank you very much, Max, and thank you to Felicitas for inviting us in this beautiful panel. Yes, I would like just to tell a story about my own journey in the climate work. Actually, there were two milestones in this journey. The first one was in 2015, because as you know, the COP21 was in Paris, and we decided with a number of French foundations to organize a kind of a host program for all the foundations coming from all over the world from the COP21. And it was maybe the first step of my journey, because I was working with foundations involved in environment and other foundations like ours, which was tackling the climate or the environmental issue through the Sustainable Food Systems Program, because of course it's a cross-cutting area with environment very included in this topic. But during the COP21, we did two other things related to climate. The first one was that the Carasso Foundation was one of the very few foundations or civil society organization that signed the 4 per 1,000 pledge, which was an initiative launched by the French Minister of Agriculture related to carbon sequestration in the soils in agriculture. And we were joining this initiative. And the other things that we did in 2015 was to sign the divest-invest movement. As you know, it is related to investment. And we decided that we would divest all our investments from carbon companies. And now, actually, we have, and I agree with what Sandrine has said, we have been very resilient during the crisis, and because we had a positive performance even in 2020. So I have to, it's a quick situation of the power of investment. And the second milestone of my climate journey was very recent. It was in 2019, during the General Assembly of the European Fondation Center again in Paris. And I was personally, I was very, very struck by the gap between the consciousness of my peer from foundations regarding the climate issue and the lack of funding. I think that only 3% in France of the French foundation are in environmental issues, and maybe less in the really climate issues. And it really struck me. And I had the opportunity to answer to a call from the EFC to write in their blog related to the 30th anniversary of the EFC. And in this blog, I wrote a call to action inviting foundations to join a philanthropic coalition for against climate change and for social justice. But this pledge was just, or this call was just a call to action with no real solutions. I was just giving some tracks, but I didn't know how to start with my colleagues. And actually, this call to action was alongside the initiative of the UK Foundation Association, because they were just about to launch their own pledge to encourage foundations, funders, to act for climate. So with this, I thought that this pledge was very practical and a concrete call to action. So then I have a talk with Max from Daphne and with my the national platforms, the philanthropic platform in France and Spain, and we decided to join our efforts in order to launch a real coalition for funders, and with the idea to embark any kind of foundations, no matter what their mission or their topic, the areas of action, because, and it was said by Sandrine, by Sonia, and by George, climate is concerning any kind of foundations, because climate is already affecting our beneficiaries. So it's really a cross-cutting issues, and I think that any kind of topics can be linked with climate issues, and I can testify that, of course, it's more obvious in sustainable food programs, but I can testify that even in our art, in the community program, we have really raised an awareness among artists about Anthropocene or about other related climate issues. So I am really, really proud to announce that we are about to launch this coalition in Spain and in France, and that last week, my board has officially announced that the Carasso Foundation will pledge, will be probably the first signatory of the French and the Spanish coalition pledge.
Very good. Thank you very much, Marie-Stéphane. That's also how you can start the journey and really bring it to a level that it really has an impact on the field. And so I'd like to ask all the panelists to unmute, and we will now enter the Q&A. And Felicitas, do you want to kick that off with the first question?
Yeah. It's going to be a fairly short Q&A, but the good thing is we'll have deep dives later on in the year and beginning of next year, because we knew that there was no way we could do justice to these panelists in just an hour. So we'll have further sessions with each of the panelists individually later on, and we'll share the dates for that at the end of the webinar. There are 2 or 3 questions I would love to for you to touch on. One is the role of finance. We talked about it. It came up again and again, but we haven't really talked about it. Marie-Stéphane, you talked about Divest Invest, which is a growing movement in Europe. But Sonia, maybe I can address that to you. where do you see the role of finance going forward, and what can foundations do in particular to strengthen that, either with their own finances or with their grant giving?
Absolutely. So thanks, Felicita. So to start, yes, you can do a lot with your own endowment and your own finance. We, for example, have pretty strict ethical guidelines that are available on our website, so feel free to go and check. But just to give you a sense, any company that generates more than 10% of their profits on any fossil fuel related business is out of our portfolio. But we also give the chance to actively engage with companies to push them in the right direction. The funding for the foundation comes from a hedge fund manager that is an activist investor, so we very much agree with that approach. And for example, our endowment manager requests every single company to produce a transition plan, a sustainability plan, and for that to be put forward to a shareholder vote that they actively shape. So, you know, a lot of scope to shape action on your company portfolios out of your own endowment. And in terms of finance more generally, obviously with COVID and greening the recovery, a lot of the injection of capital coming from major economies, that has to be shaped in a green way, and there are civil society groups that are very specialized on finance and working in aligning, for example, in Europe, the sustainable finance taxonomy with the recovery packages in each country. Those are social contracts. They need to work for us as a society to work. For emerging economies, it's different. Obviously, they haven't been printing their own funding. They have been borrowing a lot. So it's primarily about shaping debt restructuring with China and other Western economies, including performance that are climate related. We're talking about climate debt swaps and SDG bonds, etc. as an emerging economy. Again, huge amount of work from grantees on that effort is very, very important. And finally, on shaping public policy on how banks and investors engage, basically pushing ESG policies not as a voluntary matter, but as a mandatory matter, alignment with TCFD and ESG. That is opportunities we have, for example, in Spain, the new climate law that is being debated in Parliament, fantastic opportunity to include provisions on that law, where every single Spanish company should be putting forward a transition plan that is aligned with the provisions and the ambition of climate neutrality by 2050. And like that, there are many other opportunities around the world that we are seeing. So huge amount of opportunity to engage.
And we pledged that we'll put a paper together on the role of finance, where we'll explain all the wonderful acronyms you used, like TCFD and others.
I'm sorry, yes.
Just for newcomers, it sometimes can be a little bit, but just to say, finance, hugely important. Another question came up was the role of grassroots. And George, maybe I can ask you that. The question was, you know, what could be the role of grassroots movements, especially also regarding a stronger climate justice focus?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think it's quite an important element of the total approach. What we learned, also based on our experience with Porticus, is that working with grassroots organization creates new ideas, maybe a little bit more gut and courage. And I think in making this successful, you cannot do this without working with grassroots organization as well. So it's kind of, yeah, for us it's an important element of the total approach.
Great. I have one question I wanted to pose to Marie-Stéphane, and that is about the relationship to COVID-19. So what can we learn from the COVID-19 pandemic to foster climate action?
Well, I think that the coronavirus crisis is probably one of the many trans or cross-cutting crises that we will be facing in the coming years, and remind us of the fragility of our ecosystems. I think that scientists have already alerted on the impact of deforestation, of growing urbanization, that has increased the proximity between animals and human beings, what they call the zoonosis. So the link has been scientifically established. So what we are living today is probably one of the many other kind of cross-cutting crises linking climate and health, like any like other things that can be linked between climate and poverty and climate and drought and agriculture problems. So yes, I think it is I would say a proof, and it's too bad it's a proof, but a proof of these linkages.
Thanks so much. We want to end on time, but I want to give Sandrine the final word to talk about upcoming pressure points that foundations should look out for, maybe in the next year or 24 months.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm going to go very quickly building on what Sonia said. I think one key pressure point is definitely using the divestment, but not just with regard to fossil energy, but divesting from all high carbon activities and making smart choices. So how do we build communities around divestment? How do we use the youth voice in universities? Let's remember that we shifted the whole apartheid regime because of divestment, starting with universities. And then we built that out. So how do we bring both the top down? So this is part of George's point, strategically, the kind of top down, bottom up pressures together. So looking at how we can link up communities. With regard to COVID, the key for me pressure point is that actually surveys are showing that people don't want to go back to business as usual. How do we tap into that consciousness now? How do we ensure that we remind people what is essential as we start to go back into COVID and then we finally come out of COVID? What does that actually mean? So any type of community work that can be done to build people's consciousness even further of what's most important: access to food, access to water, clean environment, ensuring we don't have more pandemics, and ensuring that we have access to healthcare. The last point I'd make is that COVID has also shown us that actually transformation is possible, and very quickly. So the fact that people are saying the narrative of transformation is not possible, it's going to be too difficult, we can show that in the last 6 months, people have had to totally change their lives, and we should build on that narrative. And then the last points, two key areas that I really see as hotspots. Food systems is key. And we're seeing with the new food summit that's coming up with the UN, the discussions around regenerative communities, the big push also with the farming communities to go back to nature, nature-based solutions. This is part of what Marie-Stéphane was saying is very important. And cities, the role of cities and rural areas, and looking at both of them and how we can ensure that also rural inhabitants don't feel disenfranchised. We don't just focus on the urban cities, but that we also really shift our cities in terms of the way in which they come out of the pandemic and they invest in new infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Sandrine. And unfortunately, we have already to wrap up and close this interesting discussion. We learned we are in this together, so let's build a structure to line this, to live this togetherness as a philanthropic sector. Three calls for action here. One is join and support the Philanthropy Coalition for Climate that we are building up as a new platform for collaboration, joining resources and aligning communications. It's really about the cross-cutting element. Second, sign up to or support to set up in your country the funder commitment on climate change, a low barrier entry into climate action for any foundation. And thirdly, subscribe to PEC's news, because that is the newsletter that keeps all of us together. We're happy to share the link in the wrap-up email afterwards. Thank you very much from my side.
Thank you to all. Thank you also for CIFF for making this possible. Thank you to all the speakers for coming together today. Quick remarks from our side. We will have deep dives. You will get the dates for that in the follow-up email tomorrow. We will have further resources that we'll make available. And we will also have a recording of this webinar on our website in about a week's time. And finally, before I point you to a survey that we would love for you to take so we can continue our discussion and improve what we've done for you. A big thank you to the active team who have made all of this possible and who've been doing amazing stuff at work in the background. And with that, a big thanks to all of you who have participated. In the chat box, you can now see a link to the survey. It would be wonderful if you could take that survey, because we want to continue with webinars and other resources that help you to either make a start or to connect to other funders that have already gone ahead on the road. And it's fantastic to know that we can hopefully draw on all of the passion and experience of the wonderful speakers today on the panel. Sandrine, George, Marie-Stéphane, Sonia, great big thank you and have a good evening. And here are the links to the deep dive and the link to the surveys in the chat box. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Bye-bye.